You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome back to Business of Drinks. I'm Scott Rosenbaum.
And I'm Erica Ducey.
Today we're talking with Dan Kleinman, Chief Brand Officer at Deutsch Family Wine and Spirits. We are discussing one of the most fascinating breakout brand stories in U.S. wine. I am talking Josh Cellars.
Josh Cellars was founded by Joseph Carr in 2007 as a tribute to his father, Josh. It was meant to honor his hardworking spirit and the values of family and gratitude. And what started with a single Cabernet Sauvignon has grown into a broad portfolio of wines that consistently deliver quality at an approachable $10 to $20 price point. And that combination of story, value, and taste has helped Josh appeal to a wide consumer base and grow into one of the top-selling wine brands in the U.S., now moving over 6 million cases a year.
Wow. Yeah. Where did that growth come from? Josh benefited from smart and agile marketing, strategic distribution, and a strong focus on retail. It became a beloved brand, particularly among Gen X consumers who, the brand, it resonated with its themes of family, gratitude, shared experiences. And that connection comes to life in marketing campaigns they do, like Josh Giving. It's a holiday initiative which has raised over $1 million for charities. And it's kind of a perfect expression of how the brand ethos is connecting.
Yeah, and in the past year, Josh has also managed to capture the attention of millennials and Gen Zs. So in early 2024, they had a viral social media moment that catapulted the brand into digital culture. It sparked a 79% jump in Instagram followers in a matter of weeks and a new wave of millennial and Gen Z fans and buyers. And this is where it gets interesting. Now, instead of letting that moment pass by, Dan and his team leaned in. They created and shared their own memes in a way that felt authentic, playful, and true to the brand.
That strategy paid off, driving a surge in Google searches and bringing a whole new consumer base to the brand. It drove sales into the double digits, even as the broader wine category was struggling. And if you look at Josh's social channels today, you can see how they've really embraced the irreverent, meme-friendly tone that has helped them stay relevant with younger consumers without alienating their core audience.
Yeah, and in this conversation, Dan shares how Josh has managed to bridge generations, staying meaningful to Gen X while becoming culturally relevant to millennials and Gen Zs. He talks about how the team uses data in very interesting ways, so pay attention to the data part. But they use data, storytelling, and emotional connection to keep the brand growing. And, we're going to talk about what other brands can learn from this approach.
We also get into how they ventured into new line extensions like Seaswept, a lighter white blend aimed at younger audiences.
And if you're curious about how a wine brand can connect emotionally across generations, innovate without losing its soul, and turn a viral meme into real-world growth, this episode is for you.
Here's our conversation with Dan Kleinman of Josh Cellars.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Is your drinks brand looking to start or expand important distribution?
Whether you're seeking to enter new markets or you're unhappy with a current distributor and desiring a better fit, you should know about Swig Partners.
Founded by industry experts Eric Siegelbaum and Amy Troutmiller, Swig takes the guesswork and the legwork out of distribution strategy. Swig helps brands and distributors find the right fit for long-term relationships and sales success.
US-based importers and distributors should reach out too. With Swig, they can explore new products for free. And brands? You can get $100 off by mentioning Business of Drinks. Find out more at swigpartners.com/business of drinks. That's swigpartners.com/business of drinks.
Dan, thanks so much for coming on the Business of Drinks.
Very happy to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to talk with you and wanted to jump right in with your background. So tell me about your background and how you came to work as Chief Brand Officer for Deutsch.
Actually, the story is quite interesting. It started back in college where I got my first job in the industry. I actually, when I was a sophomore at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, I got a job working for Mass Bay Brewing Company, which is the brewers of Harpoon beer. And I was on what was called the Harpoon Brew Crew. And it was a great experience where I got to go all over New England. Doing off and on-premise promotions, working festivals, helping the selling teams sell in, and it gave me my first real indoctrination into how the beverage alcohol industry works. And as a kid who grew up in Los Angeles, getting to see all of New England, it was really the highlight of it all. I got to see places I never could have imagined, and just fell in love with the Northeast. So, kind of that got my bent on the industry and in marketing. So jumped into advertising right after that at J. Walter Thompson in New York, and got the opportunity to work on the Shefflin and Somerset account on Tanqueray Gin and J&B Vodka. And I think, that kind of really opened my eyes to, just how fulfilling this industry could be. And I got the opportunity because someone had left on the client side to kind of pitch in on the client side for a little bit. And it just opened my eyes to, advertising being such a small piece of the pie when it comes to what is involved in brand management. And I said to myself, hey, I want to do it all. And so literally 1999, I answered a ad in the physical edition of Adweek to go over and be an associate brand manager at Beck's North America. And that really started my formal, I'll call it, brand marketing career in the beverage alcohol business. So jumped from there over to, at the time, it was Guinness Bass Import Company, working on Bass Ale and Guinness, and then spent about just under 16 years working in marketing and innovation roles at Diageo. And then the opportunity to come over to Deutsch Family Wine and Spirits to work on what I saw at the time, and this was way back in 2016, which was one of those potential, really breakout juggernaut brands. And Josh was what attracted me to come to work at Deutsch. And as, kind of working at Deutsch, I was able to bring the best of my experiences in beer and spirits to the wine category. And that, resulted in me, adding responsibilities for more brands in the portfolio as my time with Deutsch went on, and then ultimately to the chief brand officer role.
Yeah. It's such an interesting story. And okay, but before we dive too much into Josh and Deutsch, I do want to hear, you mentioned being at Diageo for, over a decade. And what were some of the key moments or achievements that you had while you were there?
Sure. I think the first one was really working on brand Guinness, which is, I think, just such an iconic brand. And it's a brand that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than just, a product, because it's global footprint, the power of community it brings. And if you want to hear an incredible story, I'll tell you one from when I was in Northern Ireland. But with my time on Guinness, we really were trying to make the brand more approachable for more drinkers, because there are so many perceived barriers to Guinness. It's very filling. It's only good in a pint and in the pub. And we did a great campaign with BBDO New York called Brilliant, which was two kind of like cartoon animatronic brewmasters that just reveled in some of the most mundane ways you could enjoy Guinness that directly addressed the barriers consumer had. And it was an enormously successful campaign. We won a gold Effie for it, and really helped bring a lot of new people into the Guinness brand. So that was like the first flashpoint moment. And the second was probably really working on Captain Morgan when it was the Spirits brand of the year in 2004, and shepherding the Got a Little Captain in You campaign, which was probably the most iconic campaign the brand has run. And I think, getting people to do the captain's pose was the ultimate social media selfie before they existed. But working on that brand and really driving really strong, consistent double-digit growth was another one. I got the wonderful opportunity to lead the work on Buchanan's with the Hispanic consumer, and that's a hugely powerful brand that now has become the second largest blended Scotch whiskey behind Johnnie Walker, primarily off the strength of really strong marketing and a strong focus on the Hispanic consumer. I was there at the right at the start of our marketing of Blue Label, and a lot of the work we did in culture on Blue Label, around Blue Label engraving, to get that brand, cemented as the, really a true luxury icon. And then, closed out my time, really doing a lot of great work on Diageo's biggest volume brand, Smirnoff, where, got to completely transform everything from packaging to go-to-market approach, and did a fantastic campaign with 72 and Sunny called Exclusively for Everybody, which was our way of, kind of contrasting a world of vodka that was becoming, I think increasingly status oriented. So a ton of great experiences and a ton of great learning, and got to work with, I think, some of the best people and the best partners in the business. And I think that foundation and what I learned there in terms of modern marketing and best in class marketing is something that, continues to serve me well in my new role here at 8-9 years later.
Yeah, amazing. All right. Well, you mentioned an incredible story from Northern Ireland, so I feel like we can't
Yeah.
move away from that until we
Yeah.
hear what it is.
Yeah, so I went up to Belfast. I think it was around 2006 or 2007. And if you've never been to Belfast, it's an amazing city. Incredible architecture, incredible nightlife, and just very interesting that when we were going around into the pubs, we were partnered with, you normally be a partner with a salesman, and, you would go on his route. And in this particular case, we were partnered with two salesmen. One was a Catholic and one was a Protestant. So, and they covered the same territory, same account base, and literally, depending on the owner of the pub, one would lead the sale and one would support the account by buying a pint. And I think the best part about it was these two guys, different backgrounds, very, a lot of potential for, kind of discord there, but they were the best of friends, and their communion that they shared, despite, centuries long struggles between their religions, really just kind of cemented in me that Guinness transcends, and it's bigger than just a stout or a beer. And I think that experience and just getting the chance to see that brand living in Belfast in that way was, something that I'll never forget.
Totally, totally, and so embedded in the culture.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. All right, well, let's move to Josh Cellars. So, this brand has just had an incredible growth trajectory over the past several years. For listeners who aren't as familiar with Josh, can you walk us through the brand's history and talk a little bit about its key attributes and values?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a great history. And I think, the brand is a relatively young brand. If you think about it, really, its first vintage was around 2007. And it was started by an entrepreneurial husband and wife team, Joseph and Dee Carr. And Joe really has a great story. He grew up in, kind of in upstate New York, right outside of Troy, New York, in a town called Berlin. That is not a prosperous town, very much a blue collar, upbringing that was so far away from the world of wine that we know it. And I think he got the wine bug in college. He went to Geneseo in upstate New York, and he just kind of peered into a restaurant one night and saw, kind of a fine dining restaurant, the World of Wine, and was just entranced by it. And he kind of, it's a great story that he'll have to tell, but he faked his way with the owner to a wine steward job. And really from that humble beginning in upstate New York, he went on to become a sommelier and work for some really reputable major global wine companies. But, I think he got the itch to do his own thing and strike out on his own. And he made a great brand named after himself called Joe Carr, which was a really reputable Napa Cabernet. And obviously with, the economic situation, he was really looking to make a more approachable wine as well as his Joseph Carr brand. And so, kind of he went out to Sonoma to, kind of make the wine. And as he was looking to create the wine, he, kind of was working on the design, the label, the packaging, and he wasn't quite cracking it. So he went to his mom, Jean Carr, who was, she's recently passed, but she was a force to be reckoned with. And, he talked about the wine with his mom, and he's like, I really want to make something that really everyone could enjoy, a great quality wine that everyone could enjoy with those who matter most, but I have no idea what to name it. And she said, well, why didn't you name it after your father? And he goes, well, I can't. His name was Joe Carr too. And so she said, so call it Josh. That was his nickname. And Joe kind of was aghast. It's like, I never heard anyone call dad Josh. And she said, that's because the guys who called him Josh weren't allowed to step foot in our house. And that was his father's nickname amongst his closest buddies who were never allowed in the house. Hung out in his workshop garage, kind of tinkering around with old, machine parts, fixing chainsaws and that stuff. And those were his closest buddies. And that was their, pet name for him. And he was, Joe's dad was a rabble rouser. He raced stock cars. And so that name, Josh, kind of was like, oh my God, I have to do it with that story. And actually, Jean, the mom, used to do the church circular in their town of Berlin, and she would use calligraphy to write the title page of the church circular. And she actually designed the Josh script that sits on the bottle today. So
cool.
Very humble beginnings. And, Joe, and I'd love to have him on your podcast because he would tell it way better than I, but really scrapped everything he had together and was, selling this wine with, as much as he could afford to make, from the back of his truck, going out all around through New England. Really what started happening is in, primarily New Hampshire, but also a little bit of Massachusetts. When Josh was in distribution, it was flying off the shelves. So it was in the top 10% of rate of sale in its available store universe, which was only, a few hundred accounts. At that time, Deutsch Family Wine and Spirits, this was probably around 2010, 2011, was looking to add a California Cabernet brand into its portfolio, and were connected with Joe through the distributor in New Hampshire who was seeing that success. And they really saw, Deutsch Family Wine and Spirits, Bill Deutsch is the father, Peter Deutsch is the son, Bill is still the chairman, and Peter Deutsch is the CEO. So a lot of like for like stories about dads and what dads have passed down from a value standpoint, and how sometimes when you're growing up with dad, you don't realize what he's passing down to you, but the gratefulness you have for all that he taught and all the love he shared. So it was a perfect fit between the two brands. So we took the brand on in 2012. And I think, if you look at the brand, it just, obviously once it got into a bigger sales force with more resource, the brand really started taking off, and that high rate of sale really extended as we expanded the brand from a distribution standpoint. It was primarily Josh Cabernet. We also had Josh Chardonnay, which is also a huge brand for us, which Joe made, for Dee, his wife, because she wanted a Chardonnay. That was the scientific consumer research done in the early days. And I think if you look at the success of the brand, really a lot of it is imbued first and foremost in that packaging and the naming of the brand. And so, what we found when we talk to consumers about Josh is that Josh label does perfectly two things. It attracts people to wine for what they want in wine, which is a sense of refinement. The parchment label, the scripted J, that is really plays to what consumers look for in wine. But then consumers also have a huge barrier in wine that it is too overwhelming, kind of a little bit formal and stuffy. And the name Josh kind of disarms that stuffiness because it is a first name versus a family name. And, everyone knows a Josh, and Joshes, for whatever reason, tend to be really great guys. There's not a lot of people who say, oh yeah, I know a guy named Josh. He's the worst. It's like usually Joshes are gregarious, heartwarming guys. And so I think it does have a subtle psychological effect of saying, wow, this thing looks really premium and really refined. It must be a good wine, but it's also simple. It's welcoming, it's approaching, and so much of wine, because it, as you mentioned, is such a large category. This helped to simplify it and make it feel more approachable. So
Yeah.
that's kind of number one attribute there, which I think really has fueled and continues to fuel the success of the brand in what is a quite overwhelming category. Obviously, the second is the quality of the wine itself, and we're talking about a wine that retails for $14.99. And I think between Joe and our head winemaker Wayne Donaldson, they really stumbled on hitting the right flavor profile that delivers what a wine critic would think is a quality wine, but what is also a wine that is very approachable and can be shared. And I think you see that because Josh is one of the unique brands in wine in that it has a lead varietal, which is Cabernet, which is our biggest, but we're also in that $10 to $15 price tier, the number one or number two selling varietal in every of the major varietals. And that speaks to the quality we can hit, whether it's a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Rosé, or even our latest Seaswept, which is a white blend, a hybrid of Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Grigio. So we've gotten 90-point scores pretty much across every one of the major 8 wines that are in our $10 to $15 portfolio, which speaks to the quality. So you've got that going for you. And then the third piece is this really relatable brand story of Joe, both the love for his father and the values his father passed to him, which everyone can relate to, whether it's your dad or not. You could have a sister, a mother, a friend who, when you stop and take stock of where you've come to in life, there's always that person who you're grateful for. And I think that story resonated and still resonates with so many of our consumers in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So those are like the 3 winning attributes, back to your original question, I think, that have created the magic for this brand.
Totally. And, you talked about Seaswept. Tell me about the evolution of the brand from those original core Cabernet and Chardonnay SKUs.
Yeah, so I think when we talk about how we want to extend the Josh brand, we're very thoughtful about it. Whatever we do, one, we have to believe that we can get to that number one or number two space in the varietal that we're competing in. But really what we're trying to do with any innovation is either make sure we're expanding the occasion, Josh can be enjoyed with our core consumers, or we're bringing new consumers into the portfolio. And Seaswept is an example was dead focused on bringing newer and younger consumers into the portfolio. As the leading premium wine brand in America, we kind of feel a larger responsibility to bring in that next generation of wine drinkers. And when you look at a wine drinker in their mid-20s to mid-30s, their beverage alcohol occasion needs and consumption patterns are much different. They grew up on flavored vodka, FMBs, seltzers, now RTDs. So what you're seeing is just a push in the whole wine industry to lighter, crisper, more refreshing wine. And that's the product idea behind Seaswept, was to give them something that is equally as refreshing and sessionable as things from other categories. And the way we marketed and launched the brand was to do it in a way that was distinctly unwine, right? We wanted to get over a lot of the schema of wine that younger consumers have, that it's formal, It's stuffy. It's not right for the more casual social occasions that they have, which are energetic, fun. They don't play by the rules, and so all of the kind of marketing around Seaswept, our tagline for it was a crisp new white that was refreshing the rules of wine, and much of the marketing we did around it was playing and having fun with kind of those stodgy wine rules. I always say my favorite ad is we did an ad for Seaswept that said white wine pairs best, or wine rule number 5, white wine pairs best with chicken. And the image behind the bottle was people having a chicken fight in the ocean, in the water, because we're trying to make wine feel a little bit more approachable, a little bit less formal. We encourage people to drink it however they wanted, put ice in it, throw it in a Yeti cooler, not in a wine bucket, with a wine glass, So I think that's an example of how on Josh, we're really trying to introduce new audiences to the brand, in a way that is relevant to that audience, but still stays true to the Josh brand.
Yeah. And, to that point, Josh is continuing to grow in double digits while much of the wine industry is facing declines. I'd say, to what art do you attribute this growth? Is it distribution strategy? Is it marketing? What is the key driver there that keeps this brand really outpacing all of its competitors?
Yeah, what I'll say, the marketing guy, of course, is going to say marketing. But I do want to give credit to our sales force, because I think particularly in the early days of this brand, there was really, really thoughtful and strong work done to make sure that we had the distribution and, most importantly, the display with major US retailers to get the brand that physical availability it needed. And the approach that our sales team has taken in execution really has been, in my 26 years in beverage alcohol, second to none. So huge credit there. But in addition to that, I think the big differentiator for Josh has been really heavy focus on the consumer. And not all wine brands get that luxury because of the economics of wine, but we were lucky to have a growing and profitable brand in Josh, and leadership in the Deutsches that believed that building salience for Josh and creating emotional meaning for it would be a differentiator in growing the brand and keeping it in healthy growth. And I think, today we spend about 5x against the consumer as we do commercially, and the efforts we've had, which started a little bit before I got there. We were doing a lot of great things, but really scaled as we proved to the organization that marketing could differentiate the brand, has been really a huge feather in our cap. Advertising is the number one volume growth driver to the business each year, and we keep growing advertising's contribution and its return on investment. But we're not limited to advertising. We do, we're out at 10 to 12 festivals a year, driving trial of the product in social environments that are a bit higher energy than people would normally feel wine for. We're always doing purpose-driven promotions that help consumers express gratitude, because that's our, the sharing of gratitude is the purpose of Josh Cellars. So whether it's personalized labels or, getting armies of Joshes to go out in the community and do good, to give back, we're always trying to make this brand stand for a narrative beyond product. And I think, that's the differentiator, which Josh does stand for a narrative just beyond being a good wine. And I think, so much of what you see in wine marketing is very, it's consistent. There's a clear schema to it. It's very much focused on vineyard and growing and story behind the grape. And I think what we wanted to do was connect emotionally with brand values and a brand narrative that would connect to a higher order consumer need than just their needs in beverage alcohol. And I think that has been a driver. When you hear the stories about how people share Josh, how much they love it, you hear them playing back, the intent of our marketing, which is, as a marketer, the best thing you can have.
Totally, totally. And I hear a lot of your Diageo background coming through in this, which is the data piece. So, it occurs to me as you're talking about like the ROI from advertising and, the different campaigns and everything. I would say, how much does data really play into your decision making as a leader of this brand? Because, so I like one of the challenges that I see for a lot of wine brands is that they're not as data focused, but in everything you just said, I heard data points.
And I think I would say data and consumer understanding have been the two linchpins of our success. And the data turns some of the data gives you the what, the consumer understanding in talking to a lot of consumers really gives you the why. And so it starts with when we're positioning brands and really looking at what we call the positioning intervention, which is the primary way that we want consumers to connect emotionally to the brand. And we do a lot of work with consumers, not just digging into how they drink wine, what are their needs there, but we dive into their attitudes, their lifestyle, and their larger kind of motivational needs. And so we put a high primacy on insights and have a really high standard. We call it the 5 T's. We have to see if I'll get them all for you, but they have to be touching. They have to be true. There has to be some tension. They have to be tacit, so they have to go beyond just the surface level. And I can't remember the 5th T, so forgive me. Most of our insights that drive our positionings have nothing to do with alcohol. They're really about how we want to think and feel as humans. And so when you can tap into that in a way, into something that your brand can deliver, that's outstanding. Then we get into the data as we manifest to make sure everything we're doing is actually having the intended effect with the consumer that we want. And so we've done a lot of, we do a ton of research on the efficacy of all of our marketing to understand how it's delivering and how we can make it better. In addition, we do what we call enterprise research. So, we have a big occasions framework as an example that our consumer insight team runs. And we've done over 56,000 interviews over 6 waves across all beverage alcohol, trying to get underneath what are the core occasions for the brands in our portfolio or the categories in our portfolio, but more importantly, like what are the consumer needs? Because when you can meet the occasion need as well, that's where you start to see the volume really hitting. In kind of partnership with connecting on an emotional level. You connect emotionally, but then you have to deal in the rational. And when someone is having a family dinner, they have feelings, thoughts, needs that are very specific to the occasion. So a good portion of our marketing focuses on understanding, once they show intent for that occasion, how our brands can better meet their needs than anyone else. So we are big data people, and we found it to be enormously enlightening in our approach. We get better every time we measure something, we learn about something. And so I think that is an area that, again, the Deutsches have been very generous, where we're advantaged because we're spending a fair amount of time and a fair amount of investment uncovering those insights, uncovering the implications out of those insights, and actioning them into our marketing and sales strategies.
Yeah, that's incredible, and I think the results speak for themselves. So speaking of the consumer, what demographics are most represented amongst the Josh audience?
Yeah, I think our core audience, I would say, is adults over 40, higher income, and we don't differ extremely from the overall wine consumer demographic. We are quite proud that we do have a very strong and large buyer base amongst younger drinkers. But when you think about where that core wine drinker is in their life stage, and what the Josh brand story offers, it's a perfect fit. I think so many of us, I'm a Gen Xer, we are going through life, really trying to, cement really a bright future for our family. In a lot of cases, we're parenting down to our kids and up to our parents. And there's not a lot of time to take stock and really be thankful for who got you to where you are. And I think that is at the heart of Joe's story. So the more people we expose to that story and can find common ground in it, that's who we've seen really gravitate to the brand. And those are the generations that also have really kind of locked in on wine as being the beverage alcohol that best meets their needs when they're having, their social occasions. But we call it a twin engine strategy, which is, most of our work is focused there. But then we have seen, particularly through the viral memes, an entirely new cohort come into wine and come into the brand. And those folks are in a different stage of life. They're not looking back on the contributions of, those who've got them to where they are just yet. They're striking out, and their friend group is that really that's their family and that's their source of gratitude. So, and they have social occasions that look different. So the marketing to them has to look fundamentally different. And the great thing about modern marketing with addressable audiences is, if you can be so targeted in reaching these people with a message that really speaks to their life and their world outlook, very uniquely, and not, kind of have it overlap with how you're talking to your core group. And we've really been successful. I think that recognizing that, humans aren't one dimensional, brands shouldn't be either, has been a big freeing unlock for us. Because we know we can't just have one message that's going to resonate. You've got too many generations you're spanning. So we really try and find a way to stay true to ourselves, but at a core level, but also really focus on how are we going to be relevant to each of these different generations and life stages drinking the brand.
Yeah. So let's talk about that viral meme moment in early 2024 that as a case study, right? So how did it unfold, and what pieces were in place, either from like a resources or a personnel perspective,
Yeah.
that enabled the Josh team to very quickly act and to turn this moment, which could have just passed by, right? But they turned it into a massive growth opportunity. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it happened very organically. I think, that's the greatest thing when it starts from the consumer, but it was a very simple tweet from a guy who doesn't have a ton of followers. I think at the time he only had 32,000 followers. His name was Optimus Prime, or I think was his name. And, he just kind of, sent a very innocuous tweet, to his audience being like, hey, y'all, you got to get off this barefoot and Stella Rosa and drink the real stuff. And it was a bottle of Josh. And it exploded from there, primarily, again, because of the name Josh, a wine named Josh. Like, that's what people picked up and started talking about. And of course you had, your fierce advocates, friends of Josh coming on and posting. And then you had some people, obviously, who are, fancy wine people who may have detracted, but there was something in the name of the brand that struck a chord and struck a conversational chord that people felt was relevant. Now, we saw it, and, in those early days, I mean, the first problem we had encountered is we hadn't been on Twitter since 2019. So we didn't have a business account, and we had forgotten our Twitter password. And so many different, and our IT team, our marketing IT team, happened to all be out on vacation
Oh my gosh.
on the same night. So we, of course, tried the password too many times and got locked out for 72 hours. So that was our first But I think, we got the Twitter password back. But I think we just, as a collective group, as a brand team on Josh, and then our wonderful agency, Tombras, kind of said, let's commit to this. It's a real opportunity. And we went up to the top and said, hey, can we have some license to flex our personality, our brand character a bit, to answer this moment? And, we were fortunate to have a great creative team at Tombras who was already living social culture, and, a few members of our brand team that were also very culturally attuned and very socially native. And those people, kind of just picked up with it and ran. And I think we gave them the freedom to run, and we trusted the people who get it to do it. And I think, I always joke that half the posts I didn't fully understand as a, Gen X male. And, they obviously explained them to me, but it was, if you guys think this will work, it's going to work, and I think the other thing is we were humble about it. I think, a lot of people were commenting on our past social media work as not being that cool and how much cooler we had just become. And so we decided to create a faux intern. We said, well, we gave the social account to our new intern, Jessica. And, we really just had fun with it. And, these viral moments can be, quite fleeting, but as we saw it gained a little bit of length in its duration, that's when we really went after it. And that led to, partnerships with meme creators. It led to a partnership with Wendy's, who wouldn't be the first partner a wine brand would think to partner with as a QSR restaurant. But, I think Wendy's persona in social is so powerful. We saw that as opportunity, and we found a really great way to play with, both brands being, named after humans, and to put them on a Valentine's Day date, with, Wendy and Josh. And I think ideas like that, which really, took courage from the agency, courage from the brand team to get behind, helped kind of fuel this phenomenon, for at least, I would say 8 to 10 weeks. And then after that, you started to see, the people come out on the internet, this made our lawyers nervous, selling t-shirts with the meme sayings on them. So we had to figure out how we were going to deal with that. But what it did really do for us is it did at a time of the year in February, where, your buyer base tends to dip. It's dry January, it's post holidays where people are back into saving money. Not only did we see great buyer growth overall. I think we had a 22% buyer growth in Feb, where traditionally that buyer growth would be down. Because you're coming off the holiday period. So we had huge buyer growth. We saw a 5-point share increase in total consumption from under 35s on the brand. And, we just started to see, in culture, the conversation about Josh elevate. Obviously, it came right at the same time the Stanley phenomenon was happening with the Stanley coolers. And so that kind of SNL took note of it, and did a great clip with, I think it was Dakota Johnson, and all of those things started to really build cultural momentum for the brand. And it was great for us because we were just at that time, probably a month later, starting to launch Seaswept, which was going after that younger consumer. So it really we took the rules we played by with the memes and applied them to Seaswept, worked with a lot of influencers, really delivered that different messaging around breaking the rules in wine. And the combination of those two things, by the end of the year, we started to see real momentum with younger drinkers. So it lasted, as the end of June, we had seen, a 38% increase in volume from younger drinkers, and we rose to become the number one penetration wine, still wine, with under 40s. So, the ability to kind of react fast, stick to it, flex your brand personality a little bit, really was the reason for success. And the huge credit goes to the agency and the team that was kind of throughout the 9 to 5, was always on, reacting, generating creative ideas on social to kind of keep that momentum going.
Yeah. And there's a point in there that I want to hop in on, which is, a lot of brands that I work with, I talk with them about, hey, you can have different messages on different channels, because though, one audience, which may be the over 40 audience, is not in the same place as the under 40 audience, for example. So I think Josh has done a really smart job of essentially threading the needle on channel strategy from a marketing perspective. So can you tell me how, like, your philosophy around that? So, like, for example, I think the idea that I'm getting at is, on the one hand, you see Josh and a lot of advertisements talking about, the hardworking ethos, the family
Yeah.
man, all of that. And that's like one set of messaging. But then on other channels, it's really the meme based marketing, which, appeals to that other audience. How do you approach that? And actually, how do you sell it to the higher ups to say, hey, this one set of meme based marketing is not going to offend or upset our core
Yeah.
audience?
I think it's a great point. I think, the memes taught us that the context of the channel is everything. Prior to the memes, if we looked at, let's just use Instagram as an example, the way we were, making content, we were trying to deviate from looking like every other wine. But I think, if I was tough on us, maybe we weren't as differentiated as, we thought we were. And I think what we saw with the memes, and as we started to create our own content from us versus from others, was the engagement was on such a transformational level. And so that's the consumer telling you, like, when I'm on this channel, I'm probably looking to be entertained and to have a laugh versus to be educated, because it's such a quick scroll. And I think, the great news is, going back to data as we had it. I think, I think we could easily show our exec, like, let's just look at the response levels from January 7th on, and let's go back 2 years, right? And just look at how people are interacting. We didn't lose followers. Our demographic, it did get younger, but the core of who was following us before still was following and engaging. When we shifted our approach in paid social to be a little less polished, a little bit more real, we still saw the same brand uplift. We increased our ROI. So we had all the proof points that by playing to the context of the channel, you're going to win. And so I think that does frame our approach moving forward. And the best example I can show, I just looked at it because it's in recent past, is, every year, probably for the last 7 years, on Father's Day, we would have a very touching post about the original Joe Carr, and it always got nice engagement. This year, it was just a picture of the Josh Cabernet bottle with the line, "Who's your daddy?" underneath it for Father's Day. And it was like, I didn't even approve that one. So kudos to the team for doing it. And the engagement level was 10x. Then I went back and looked in the past 4 years, whatever we had gotten on Father's Day. So there's something where you have to really understand the endemic consumer behavior on the platform and try and meet that behavior, which is trying to mold the behavior to what you want to communicate to the brand, which is something now that really frames our approach, particularly going after that next generation of wine drinkers. I don't think they want brands preaching out. I think they want to be welcomed in, and they want to see that you get how they live their life. And I think if you look at our social approach, whether it's paid or organic, that is very much the focus.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got the viral moments.
Yeah.
Let's also talk about marketing campaigns. What types of broader marketing campaigns have been most effective for the brand?
I think, it's probably, there's probably three kind of pillars I say we've had success. The first is actually just telling our story in a way that emotionally resonates. And that is really as simple as mining through the stories of the creation of the brand and kind of the why behind that creation that has connected with people. So that work really, not only does it drive volume for us, but that is the work that we're seeing, particularly with that Gen X and older audience, is creating the emotional connection that builds long-term demand. So that's kind of pillar one. And so that is what we tend to run in more longer form CTT, OTV, linear TV constructs. When, you're on your couch, you're looking to be, not only entertained, but in some cases touched and inspired. So that works really well for us there. The second big thrust is, as big of a brand as we are and as many varietals we have, I still think 75% of our consumers, maybe it's down to 72, only drink one varietal of Josh. So the big opportunity for us is to get that loyal Josh Cab drinker to give Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay or Pinot Grigio or Rosé or Pinot Noir a shot, because once they get into drinking two varietals, I think they drink, a significantly more, I don't want to, number of cases per year of Josh than if they just stick in Cab. And we have that data, back to the data point, that shows the number of cases per year to a one varietal to a two or more is just seismically, different. So we do a lot of work, and this is very targeted, addressable work, identifying Cab buyers and really delivering a message track that will open them up to choosing one of our varietals over what would be one of their normal favorites in Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. That's more of a very, it's a very scientific, performance marketing driven approach. So that's probably number two. And the third is living our brand purpose and culture. So if our purpose is to share gratitude, we're always looking to find ways to help people share gratitude. We've done a lot of work and on what we call the circles of gratitude. You have different circles in your life, from the inner circle of the ride or die people to that second circle, who are the type of people who are, if you're late coming home from work, they'll pick your kid up at the bus stop, to the people we're most grateful for, like the Army, fire, military, because they do things we don't have the courage to do. But they note, particularly with that ride or die circle, there is a difficulty in expressing gratitude because they've contributed so much to your life. So we're always looking for ways that we can tangibly help consumers do that, big or small. We do that. One of our most successful commercial ways we've done it is through a personalized label program, which allows you to, put a message and a picture of, those who matter most on a bottle of Josh. And we do it every holiday. We've just actually done it now year round, where you can do it for all sorts of occasions. You have to pay now for the label, but it's just a great, simple way of saying, thank you, or I love you. And it's very funny. I always joke. We do it, we leave it open, and it's quite clear the people, the people that people are most grateful for are their dogs. We get more dog labels than humans, weddings, husbands, wives. So that's a very unique insight that we're going to leverage moving forward. But whether it's that, or, we've done a big pop-up in Grand Central to celebrate dads, on Father's Day, to get dad a meaningful gift. We had a promotion earlier this past April for Mother's Day, because Joe's mom, Jean, contributed so much to the brand, and thanking mom for all that she does is so hard. We did a great promotion where we had phone booths all around the US, where you could call in and deliver a personalized thank you message to your mom right there in the moment. And we, allowed people to win an experience with their mom based on, delivering a heartfelt message. So we're always looking, we call them purposeful promotion, to live our purpose in tangible ways that help consumers. So those three pillars have really been the drivers over the last 7-8 years of keeping us in that strong double-digit growth.
I love that. Okay, I also want to talk just a little bit about channel strategy from a sales perspective. What does the channel mix look like from, wholesale, like from
Yeah.
retail,
Yeah.
on-premise, DTC wine club?
We're a primarily wholesale brand. DTC is pretty fledgling for us. I think we want to be respectful to the retail partners who have, built the brand for us in partnership with us. But also, DTC offers such great opportunities to deliver over and above value for those who are most loyal, and gives you great access to data and understanding of, who your most fanatical consumers are. So it has benefits well beyond sales. But we're primarily a wholesale driven brand with, the majority of our sales in the off-premise environment. On-premise, we're huge. It's just very difficult to keep up with the tremendous growth we get in retail. But on-premise has been our fastest growing channel consistently for the past half decade. And we are now, I think we are the number one Cabernet served on by the glass lists on premise. And we've really done a great job, particularly post COVID, where there was a shift, I think, in the restaurateur's mind, to really give people brands they could trust as a by the glass option. And so, particularly in the national accounts universe, our national accounts on premise team has done a fantastic job of just expanding our menu placement footprint. They've just been phenomenal. So we have a really great on premise presence, both in chains and independent restaurants, that just provides that, extra point of physical availability, that, arm's reach ability to enjoy the brand you love for consumers. So that's key for us. But, I would say that the core of the business is really driving that off-premise business, particularly in the grocery and mass channels.
Okay. All right. And at this point in your career, you have worked with so many different brands, different categories, different subcategories. If you were advising an up-and-coming entrepreneur in the drinks business on how to build a brand with staying power, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think for me, it really is, you do have to think about how you're going to build connection beyond your product narrative. I think, big or small, it can get easy to say, look, I've got to spend to get it in distribution, get it tasted in the store. But, I think what you see, the brands that differentiate, and in wine, it's hard to differentiate because there's just so many brands out there. They need to strike an emotional chord, and you need to put a primacy on what are we doing to win with the consumer? What are we doing to make the consumer aware of us, think of us in a buying moment, and really want to integrate us into their lives in some degree beyond, just that one occasion. And I think it's a very hard tension for smaller brands starting up, because there's a temptation to spend to get those big grocery retailers, and that can use up all the money. But it's the difference between getting the bottle to the shelf, which is hugely important in the early days, but what's going to pull the bottles off the shelf? And I think there's no way to get around that other than, creating some meaning, meeting a need in a consumer's world. So it's a tough, it's a tough thing to do, and it's an expensive thing to do, but it is, unfortunately, particularly now as the industry shrinks, it's a mandatory thing to do in my mind.
Yeah. All right. And it's just starting to wrap up. So, it seems that every person in the wine industry is debating this topic right now, which is what's wrong with wine? Why are we seeing the most declines of any category in wine?
Yeah, and I think a little bit of it is, we aren't connecting the same way other categories are. If we look at how particularly spirits, I would say, has resonated with younger drinkers, they're just much more present in popular culture and in consumers' lives beyond the channel. When you look at spirits brands and beer brands, I mean, they massively outspend wine with the consumer. And I think, that has had an impact because those categories are more relevant, connecting more with broader audiences because they're out there speaking to them. And I think wine is primarily confined to speaking to the consumer in the on-premise channel through a wine list or a sommelier, if there's a sommelier in the restaurant, and in the off-premise channel with, what they see in the store and if there is a store staff. And really that has been something where if you're just not seeing it and you're just not seeing other people choosing it and you don't see it in the occasions you're having, you're not connecting with it. So I do think, wine is being impacted by that failure to really create those narratives beyond product because, there are lots of options out there, from THC to other categories of beverage alcohol to functional drinks to soft drinks that, can meet the rational need quite well, and I think it's getting into that emotion of what wine can bring, and really kind of having wine attack what are, larger, particularly with younger drinkers, larger, kind of societal forces that are happening. We don't socialize as much as we used to. We have a much bigger epidemic of loneliness, and how we can be the solution, not, something that helps overcome that challenge consumers facing is what wine has to focus on, as is all beverage alcohol, frankly. But I think if we bring it back, that, that the less powerful and frequent and kind of higher order communication of the consumer has made wine a little bit less relevant. They're projecting what they know and they believe onto wine from their early experiences versus hearing from wine around how great it could be at enhancing time spent with those who matter most or others close to you.
Yeah. All right. And going back to Josh here, where do you see this brand 5 years from now?
Well, we have huge ambitions for it. We see it as being kind of one of the highest. I would say we see it passing thresholds for volume and revenue that very few wine brands have passed. But ultimately, in 5 years, as we look at it, we see it as a vibrant brand that has brought in the next generation of drinkers into the fold and who are sharing it with their friends, their family, and continuing to, delight our, kind of core consumer for years to come by, touching them emotionally. We'll never stop really trying to, kind of learn about, what is most important to them and how we can help enhance, the occasions they look to enjoy our brand with. So I see in 5 years, just, people saying about Josh, wow, it has transcended wine. It's broadly drunk by all demographics, ethnicities, and it really has stood out for something that has meaning in culture to consumers.
All right. And last question. A drinks entrepreneur asks you for a source of insight or inspiration. Could be a book, a movie, online class. What or who do you recommend following and why?
Oh, I was going to say, the biggest thing I can recommend is having lots of conversations with a lot of people that and laddering, asking a lot of questions of why. I mean, I really enjoy reading Case Studied. I think Case Studied is a great, kind of example of how marketers in all different ways have built brands. I mean, I think, I get so much inspiration just from LinkedIn and seeing and hearing stories of what folks have done. I think the World Advertising Research Council work is a phenomenal resource for inspiration. So there's just so many case studies, and it's really such a diverse set that you can see really how brands have gone out and tried to create really different go-to-market models that have been successful. But I do think it's just I always say curiosity is the biggest, and you got to be curious about your consumer, the category, the craft of marketing. Be a real student of your category, not just your brands. Don't navel gaze, because you can pick up so many little insights from just being curious out in the marketplace. People always ask me, if I came to work for you, Dan, what's the number one quality you admire? And I always say curiosity.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing advice. And I think that is a great place for us to conclude. So, Dan, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think our listeners are going to get so much out of this episode. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored.
Hello, welcome to Last Call. Scott here with Caroline and Erica. And today we are discussing AI. I recently read a blog post in a blog called Modern Chaos. The title of the post was A is for Augmentation, Not Automation. It was by Olivier Legris. And basically, he points out that he says, quote, we're going from creators to curators. The evolution with AI is clear. We're becoming less creators and more curators and editors. The greatest productivity gains come not from AI working for us, but from us working with AI and collaborative partnership. And this got me thinking that, aren't so many people in the beverage industry curators of sorts, whether you be a sommelier or a beverage director or a portfolio director at a distributor. So I wanted to get your all thoughts and see what you were thinking.
I completely agree that sommeliers and people working in hospitality and the drinks industry are so much curators. And in a world where there's so much amazing wine, one must be a curator for their particular community that they are serving. You know, I work with so many people in the restaurant business as a sales rep. And the people who have the most success are the ones who are master curators, right? But I started thinking about how I've started to use AI in the ways that I can in my everyday as a wine sales rep. And we've actually been using a very cool tool that utilizes AI to create text sheets and sales sheets faster to give our sales reps a better opportunity at having more time to engage with the customer rather than creating sales materials. The thing with that is it does require that essential like 5 to 10% of editing. Make sure, first of all, these text sheets are accurate the way that the information has been pulled from a website or another place, but also how you're delivering that information to a buyer. Like I do see myself as a curator of information of the wines that I sell to each buyer and make obviously one size won't fit all there. I can't come to every single buyer with the same exact information, even if it's about the same set of wines. I think there's so much nuance to matching their mood and reading the room and the context of the business that they're working in and their history. So there's so much that can't be fed into the AI sales materials that I don't fear that my job is going to be stolen by AI. But yeah, what do you think, Erica?
And I think different types of jobs are going to be impacted more or less. So, just this morning, I was reading an article in the Times that was talking about the indicators that we should be looking at for the potential forthcoming impact of AI. And one of them is college graduate job placement rates. So, for like new grads. And that's being looked at as sort of a harbinger of how AI will potentially impact the overall job market. And what they're seeing in talking with hiring firms, especially at like white collar jobs like bankers, lawyers, that sort of thing, is that now with AI, these job places can do the same amount of work with a fraction of the humans. So they were giving an example of a particular law firm that in the past would have hired 20 new grads as paralegals. But this year, they're hiring 5 new grads and training them up because they've learned over the past year and a half that AI can do the same amount of work as the 15 other paralegals, right? So, how will this impact wine and spirits and the drinks market overall? Well, I think there will be opportunities. So, for example, thinking about your role, Caroline, of like working with buyers at particular establishments. Maybe there's AI opportunities there to understand in the past 12 months, this buyer was interested in X, Y, and Z products. And like now there's some sort of recommendation of other things that they may be trying to fill based on, I don't know, maybe their menu has been uploaded. Who knows? There's all of these analysis opportunities. But I think where we don't need to be as concerned is with, the boots on the street. I think all of those partnerships and, IRL interactions are just as important as they ever have been. And it's all too easy when you don't have real people, in front of their customers to just like overlook an email communication or a text or what have you. So I think that we will see certainly in hospitality roles, in sales roles, in a lot of roles where you currently need to have a relationship in order to move product or do business, that those things will continue, but there will be optimizations. And unfortunately, some parts of the business, not just in drinks, but everywhere, such as in the legal side of the business, in logistics, in marketing, a lot of these things will be automated. So certainly you'll need those few curators, but is that 75% fewer humans? Who knows?
It very well might be, but I, for one, am excited to see what a fuller embrace of AI and technology in the drinks business could look like. That is all we have time for. So thanks again for joining us on the Business of Drinks. Please follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Tap the notification button and you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops. Rate us in the star ratings if you enjoy listening, and please share us on social. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, you can message us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or in our email at podcast@businessofdrinks.com. Talk to you soon.